Let's take a look at the manual cabling process in Creo Parametric. First, there are a couple setup items that you need to know about. You have to have connectors, which are Creo Parametric part models, and the geometry you will typically get from an imported file like a step file or an IGES file, and DigiKey, Molex, and TE.com are great sources for those different files that you could use for making your connectors, and a variety of other suppliers provide model files for you to use. Also, GrabCAD.com is always a great site. But I have come across situations in which I could not find geometry on any of those different websites, so I had to grab one of the connectors, break out my calipers, and take a bunch of different measurements. And you don't need really precise geometry. For example, that looks like a DE25 connector over on the right. That's probably way more detailed than you need for cabling. The connectors are also going to need a coordinate system for your entry port or entry ports. And the important thing is that the z-axis is going to point along the direction that the wire is going to be routed. The x direction and y direction of the axes does not matter. And when you're setting up those coordinate systems, there are two different ways to go. You could use a single entry coordinate system that all the wires route into or out of, or as in the example, you can see that we have a number of different coordinate systems, one for each point. And actually that model has both set up depending on which method that you want to go for the routing. And other optional items that you could put in your connectors are axes for helping route the wires, and maybe even points to use as locations for the wire routing. And typically that point would be on the axis. If you are creating your cabling harness part in a cabling subassembly, oftentimes you'll create a skeleton model, and in that skeleton model you'll put data sharing features to grab references for routing your wires and cables. And typically those are shrink wrap features and copy geometry features. To perform the manual cabling process, first you'll go to the Applications tab and then choose Cabling. Typically what I do next is create my spools or read in pre-existing spool files. Then I will designate my connectors to tell Creo Parametric that I want to use them as starting and ending points for my routing. And when you designate the connectors, you also designate which entry ports you're going to use. Then you can create your harness part, and then you'll route your cables. And after you do the simple routing of the cables, typically you'll adjust them using the reroute command, or you can click on a segment of the cable and you'll get a mini toolbar that'll also have the reroute command. And if you hold down the right mouse button, you'll also get the ability to insert locations. And then once you're done your routing and adjusting of the routing, you might add in additional cabling accessories. For example, you could take a bunch of wires that go along the same path and create a bundle, or you might add cosmetic features like markers, tape, and tie wrap. Alright, here I am in Creo Parametric. I've got an assembly open and it's got a few connectors, and I'm just going to route a few wires and cables inside of here. First off though, let me show you one of these connectors. I'll open it up in its own separate window. I'm going to turn on my coordinate system visibility for a moment. You can see that this particular connector has a number of different coordinate systems. You can see the names over in the model tree. And there's one called entry that's currently hidden. I will show it. And that one called entry is typically used if you're going to route all your wires and cables just into one entry port, but we also have individual entry ports for pins 1 through 5 and also S, G, N, and P. Inside of my assembly there are a couple of structural components, and then we have a harness subassembly that contains all the electronic components and the connectors, and I'm going to perform the routing inside of here. And when I expand it, I see that this does not have a skeleton part, and in order to facilitate my routing, let's start off and activate that subassembly. You can see in the lower left hand area of the graphics area that it tells me the active subassembly is that particular subassembly. And I'll click on the create command In the Create Component dialog box, it already has skeleton model selected. It's suggesting a file name to me. I will click the OK button, and I will use, let's browse to a different start part. Maybe I want to use my metric start part, and then click the OK button. And there my harness is created as the very first component. And I want to grab a couple of routing references from the two structural components, just a couple of different surfaces. So let's activate the harness subassembly. And if I use the copy geometry feature, that will only allow me to reference surfaces from one individual part. But let's say I want to grab surfaces from two different parts, two or more parts. When I'm doing cable routing, I'm using shrink wrap more and more with the manual collection option as sort of a way of creating a copy geometry at the assembly level from multiple different components. Let me show you what I mean. With the harness skeleton activated, I'll click the shrink wrap command. And instead of using outer shell or auto collect all solid surfaces, I'll use manual collection. In this particular situation, there's only a couple surfaces I really need in order to perform the routing. First, I've grabbed one surface from one part. I'll hold down the control key and grab this other surface. If I go to the references tab, you can see where we have those different surfaces added in here. And that's really all I need as visual references for my routing. If there are some other datums like axes that I knew I wanted to grab, I could go ahead and add them as well, but really this is all I want. And let's call this, I always like to rename this with the name of the source model. And hit the enter key so it takes the name. Now I hit the check mark and our shrink wrap feature is created. Let's open up the harness subassembly in its own separate window, and there you can see the components that were brought in, plus I've got my skeleton part which added those two individual surfaces. Now I've done all the setup. Let's next proceed on to the manual cabling process. First I will go to Applications and then Cabling, and if I go to the spools command, right now I could read in a spool or create spools. Rather than create them, I'm going to click the read button, and it automatically goes to my spool directory. There is a config.pro option called pro_spool_dir, and you can set that to a folder where you have a bunch of different spools. I'm going to use the shift key to select all of them and then click the open button. And if I click on the edit command now, I can select the select all icon, then click the OK button. And in the electrical parameters dialog box, you can see all the spools that I just brought into my model. And they've got a number of different columns in here for the various properties. And you'll see that we have a number of different wire spools, looks like about 8 or so, plus a cable spool. And next to the cable spool, there is a triangle that I can expand. Then I'll expand conductors. We can see that this has 4 individual conductors in this particular cable. If you change to conductors, the conductors radio button, you can see the properties of each individual one of those fibers that are in the cable spool. But we go back to connections, and there we can see the properties for the individual wires and the cable itself. And so we see different values in here, like for the minimum bend radius. Wow, some of these have really small values. These are really, really thin wires over here. Let's cancel out of here and then click Done Return. So now I have my spools read in. The next thing I typically do is designate my connectors. So I'm going to turn on my coordinate system visibility. I'm really only going to route a couple of wires and that one cable. So let's turn on our coordinate system visibility for a moment. And the first connector that I am going to designate is going to be this one over here. So let's go to the drop-down list that says Auto Designate. And here is the Designate command. And now in the message area, it's prompting me to select an assembly component for connector definition. And I'll click this particular connector. Now it asks me for a file name to read in connector parameters. And there are some connector parameters associated with this particular model that you could use if so desired. Generally, I find that unnecessary, so I use the default values. Later on, I'll show you how you can see the parameters for these individual connectors. Now it asks me for the entry ports that I want to use. So I'll click Entry Ports and then Add, and it prompts me to select one or more entry ports. So let's select entry 1, and I'm holding down the Control key, just grabbing a number of these. Now I'm really only going to use 5 of them, but let's just grab, let's see, there's my ground. Actually, let's grab power and neutral. Okay, click OK. And now it asks me for the internal length inside of the connector. And these entry ports are on the front face of the connector. Really, I need to add in a little smidgen of wire to represent how far inside of the connector that it's going to go. And I believe I am, let's see, I think my subassembly is in metric units. So let's use about 5 millimeters length inside of there and hit the enter key. And for each one of these entry ports, I could specify that it's capable of taking a single conductor, which is the wire option, or if I'm allowing each of those ports to take multiple different conductors, do I want a round or flat layout for the wires that go into this? And I'm going to use a round layout in case I want more than one coordinate system to be listed inside there. So that's good. Let me hit the, or excuse me, more than one conductor to be routed inside of there. And hit done out of there. And let's see another one that I want to use. I want to use 3 of these for the cable that I am going to route. Let's choose the designate command, and I'll pick this particular component. And again, I'll hit the check mark to accept the default parameters. And for the entry ports, I'm just going to add in this one called entry, and then OK. And for the internal length inside there, let's use a value of 5 again. And this is just going to accept a single individual wire. And then I'll click done and done again. And I need to designate a few other different components. I'm going to repeat the process that I just used, but I do want to make a few other different wires available here for routing. So I'm going to do that, and we'll come back in a moment when I am done designating my different components. And I am done. When you go into cabling mode, you automatically get a column for designation. You can see how we have a number of these different connectors that have been designated. I have purposely designated fewer than I actually need for the cables I'm going to route, and there's a method to my madness, and I'll show that later on. You can also see here we have the spools that we read in, and those are assembly level features in our cable harness assembly. So now we have our spools, we have our designated components. I mentioned that you could take a look at the parameters of the different components. If I go to the cabling parameters command, and then I can select one or more of these items. Let me select these different ones that I designated, and then click the OK button out of the menu. Here we can see that right now we have the component and its reference designator, which is right now the same name as the model that's being used because it's unique. I can expand over here and we can see different entry ports that have also been designated as well. And if you go to the View drop-down menu and choose Columns, here are the other different parameters that you could have for a connector. So for example, you could specify the maximum number of pins. You could specify whether it is male or female. There's this option attached to harness that you could use as well. And I'll mention that in a moment. And let's add one other one in here. Let's use type. And then I'll click the OK button. So that way we have a bunch of other different columns in here. So for example, if I select the clip and this for the gender and go to the drop down, here's where you can choose female or male. For this other option here for type, if you go to the drop down list, here you can specify whether it's explicitly a connector, an inline connector, or whether it's going to be used as a splice component. Again, you really don't need to fill that out. Now this other column here attached to harness, this is if you are using Pro harness, which is the mode that allows you to create the flattened harness, sort of the nail board version that someone would use to flatten this out. And by default, when you create a flattened harness, it doesn't bring the connectors along with it. But if you attach the connectors to the harness, then they'll be brought over to Pro harness mode so that you can incorporate them into the routing of your flattening of your wires and cables. All right, I haven't changed anything. Let's just hit the cancel button over here. Now I am ready to create my harness part inside of my subassembly. Let's click. Actually, before I do that, again, I always like to make sure what set of units that I am in my assembly. Earlier I'd guessed that I was in millimeters. Actually, I'm in inches. That is good to know because that way when I go to create my harness part, I can choose the correct template. And for the part over here, let's call this harness underscore 2364-1, just using the name of the assembly -1, and then click, let's uncheck use default template, because again, I want to make sure that I am using the right set of units. And let's try, oh, so here we have inch-pounds harness part. That's good. Click the OK button, and now we have our harness part listed down over here, and we're ready to route some wires and cables. So let me turn on my coordinate system visibility again, and I'm going to start off by clicking the Route Cables button, and let's just do a couple of individual wires. And so I am going to click on this button here to create a new wire feature to route. And from this drop-down list, we can choose what spool that we want to use. And I want to use, let's use, wish I had a 20 gauge in black, but I don't. Let's just use, I'll use some non-standard colors. Let's use a blue 18 gauge, and we'll use that to route from, and I'm going to choose this particular coordinate system as the starting location, and then it automatically goes to the collector for the to location. I'm going to have that route over to this particular entry port that I already designated, and you can see a preview of the routing of the wire. So that's good. I can click the apply button, and what that'll do is it'll create that particular wire or cable and then reset the dialog box so I can create another one. Let's create another wire, and for this particular wire I want to use something of the same gauge. Let's just use the orange option, and again I'm going to choose an entry port to start from. We'll use the N from that particular connector, and then we'll route it over to this particular location. And right now, if you go to this drop-down list, we have the simple route option. You could also follow a cable if you already had a cable that was routed, or if you have pipelines in your model, you could follow along a pipeline. But we don't have any of those different choices, so I'll choose simple route. If you have something called a network in your cable harness, you would have that additional option. But again, I don't have that, so I can't use that. So we're just using a simple route where it's taking into account the minimum bend radius of your spool and just basically routing from one coordinate system to another. But in a moment, I'm going to alter the routing of these wires and cables. Let's click the apply button one more time so that we can reset the dialog box. And this time I'm going to create a cable. And for the cable, here it automatically selected our only available spool, but you could actually create a new spool while you are inside of here. And this particular spool wants 4 conductors, and so I'm going to start off by routing the first cable inside of here. Let's click in the to collector. I'm just going to route from the entry 1 coordinate system. And I'm just going to go down the line to these other entry ports that are already designated. So that's good for the first cable. For the second conductor inside of this cable, let's go to entry 2. Let's click in the from collector. By the way, besides clicking in the from collector, if you hold down the right mouse button from the pop-up menu, you can also activate the from collector. And let's route from entry 2 to this particular entry port. And let's go on to the third conductor, and let's right click again and activate the from collector and choose 3, and then the to collector. Let's go to this other designated connector that I have in here. Now this cable will only be complete when I route this other one, and so let's activate the from collector. Actually, to be different, let's activate the to collector first. And if you go to the options drop down menu, you can allow an undesignated coordinate system. And so for example, this coordinate system was not designated for the component, so I'll go ahead and select it. And it tells me that routing to this coordinate system will cause the parent component to be designated as a connector. So I'll click the OK button, and again, it's sort of like we're designating it on the fly. Enter a file name to read connector parameters, and now we need to click in the from collector, and I'm just going to have this route from this, not that one, here from entry 4. That's good. And so everything is showing up without the red dots. It's got the little sort of yellow star next to it indicating that it is new. And that's the only other one that I'm going to route in here. So I'll click the OK button. And there you can see my wires and cables. And if these wires and cables had names that corresponded to the names of colors I had in my file, it would automatically update to those colors. But I don't have that, so they don't. Let's uncheck the coordinate system display. And right now, because I didn't have a network and I just routed the individual connectors one by one, it sort of routed all of them together as this particular, just sort of like individual conductors. So let's take a look at how to do some minor modification of the routing. Before I do any modification, I'm going to use the InGraphics toolbar to change the display style from thick cables to centerline cables, because this allows me to click on different objects and then route them. And for these two particular wires over here, I'm just going to route them so that they go along the floor of this panel and then through these two clips and then between these components over here. So to do that, I'm going to click on one of these wires and then hold down the right mouse button, and I can choose to insert locations. And let's go to the items tab over here. Right now, for the first new location, it is going to be on an entity. I'm going to pick on this surface that I chose for as my reference that I brought in. And then for the next location from that one, I can choose to use a direction. I'll pick this edge over here. Just get a nice little straight segment. That is good. For the next location, I'm going to change to the on option. Just pick another point over here. And I'm a big fan of using use direction. Let me pick, say, like this edge over here, just because I think it looks really neat for laying out the wires and cables in those positions. And let me choose next location. I'm going to choose on. And let's turn on our axis visibility. And for the next location, let's choose along axis, and I'll pick that axis over there. So now it's on that axis. And if I hold down the right mouse button, along axis is still selected. So let's pick this one over here. So I'm getting some nice routing. And now let me uncheck the option for along axis. And I'm just going to pick a location on the surface over here. And then another location over here. And I can grab that location and move it out a little bit. And if I'm happy with that as the routing, I can hit the check mark and that wire is routed. Again, you can always toggle between the center line and the thick cable display. And for this other particular cable over here, rather than redo all that, I can use what's called the reroute command, which is available from the mini toolbar. I believe it's also available from the, oh no, just the mini toolbar, the reroute command. And the reroute command says basically you're going to pick up one existing location, a starting location, and an ending location, and this wire is going to be rerouted between those different location points. So there's my start location, pick this as my end location, and now both of those wires are following this routing. So I like that for that particular one. For the other wires and cables, again, I can go to a center line display, and let's select this and then hold down the right mouse button and insert location. So I'm going to do this one a lot quicker. I'm just going to pick a few different locations in here just to route along, and then let's choose along axis. There we go. Oops, let me hit the undo button. Didn't like that. And when you choose along axis, I forget, it automatically creates 2 location points along both ends of the axis for you to use. And that's the last one I'm going to do for that particular one, so I can hit the check mark. And just like before, I can select other different wires and use the reroute command for all of these and have it just route from that location to that location along there, and then hit the check mark. And there we have these particular wires routed in the model. So that's an example of the manual cable routing process. Also, I just want to mention that after you do the various different modifications, you'll notice that now we have the ability to create markers, tape, and tie wrap as our different cosmetic features. Here is the bundle command if I wanted to add some bundling around the different cables in here. And I'm going to take this same assembly and I'm going to repeat the process, except I'm going to do it using what's called logical referencing. You see this area here for where we have the logical data group. We can import what's called an XML file that's generated from Creo schematics and use that to automatically generate our spools, designate our components, and then create our wires and cables and help with the routing with their starting and ending locations. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindchill.com. If you learned something from this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this video, please click the subscribe button to be informed when new videos are uploaded. Thank you very much.